So learners really need two passes at whatever, at least two passes at it. And you're asking them to do something and go a little bit deeper from the first to the second read. And so essentially, it's a series of 3 performance assessments. So we're looking at the 3 modes of communication: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. So these modes are linked through a theme. So just really quickly, interpretive, if you're maybe familiar, I have to give credit to Thomas Sauer, who taught me these hand gestures, but this is the way you can remember the modes. Interpretive is when you are reading or interpreting, listening, viewing. So it's sort of a one-directional communication where you're looking at authentic resource, hopefully, and it's interpreting. Interpersonal, we have a back and forth. So you're listening and responding, listening and responding. So it's a two-way communication. So you can think of a sort of authentic conversation you may have. Presentational, our hands are going this way. So it's me presenting out. We're back to a one-way communication where I need to be aware of who my audience is, what they may or may not know, etc. So with an IPA, we're really trying to take these 3 modes and tie them together with a theme, and think about how we really use language in the real world to communicate. So for example, I might read an article, so that's interpretive. I'm like, wake up in the morning, I like to read the newspaper on my phone or my iPad. So I read an article, and then later in the day, I'm like, hey, my friend or whoever, I read this interesting thing. Let me tell you about it. We have a conversation. And then maybe I'm like, you know what? I want to post a comment because I was really interested in this and I want to just respond to the author, and I'm into presentational. So that sort of article has been linked, and that's essentially what's happening with the IPA. Important as part of this as well is that learners are getting feedback. So they know how they did with the interpretive, so they can use that information in the interpersonal. They know how they get some feedback on interpersonal, so they can use that to accomplish the presentational. So there's sort of a theme that's woven across the 3 modes. Let me talk a little bit about how this unit would flow then, because I said earlier that the mistake I made, and I think a lot of us have made, is putting the IPA at the end. So giving the whole summative assessment, those 3 separate assessments at the very end of the unit. And it took me over a week and it was exhausting. I would advocate embedding it throughout the unit. So when you actually start teaching this unit, really, we're starting with a heavier focus on interpretive communication. We're building their vocabulary. We're having them read and listen and view a lot of those authentic resources. So in this case, looking at what are some examples of this gender inclusive language she's talking about from Argentina. How did all of that work? So they're doing a lot of sort of reading or listening and discussing of what they've read earlier in the unit. And then at some point, let's just, to make life easy, let's pretend this is a 6-week unit. So I spend 2 weeks on the first chunk, really heavy emphasis on interpretive, and then I decide to give the interpretive assessment. I pick an authentic resource and I develop the comprehension questions and I administer it. So part 1, and that's maybe like a quiz grade or however you feel is appropriate. Then I shift to a heavier focus on interpersonal. So we've learned a lot about this. Now we're going to engage in discussions, debate, maybe taking different perspectives on the topic. Having a heavier emphasis here on interaction. And then at some point I'm going to say, okay, now we're going to film a conversation you two are having, or we're going to use the language lab if you have access to one, or a recording app on your phone to have an audio conversation. And that's going to count as your assessment for interpersonal. And now we're going to shift gears in the last 2 weeks of the unit, and we're going to develop that social media campaign. You've learned a ton, you've talked a lot about it, they've got good use of the vocabulary, good use of whatever the structures are we're working on, and now they're going to sit down and start writing what they want to create, writing whatever they want for the social media, creating those social media things, etc. And that would be my final assessment. The presentational for me always feels a little bit more like a project, which when I started was something I was doing a lot of projects. That feels a little bit more like project based. That might feel more familiar, but that might be more of a focus on And presentational can be a writing, it can be a video, it can be any number of things. These things, as long as it's sort of one way for an audience, or we're creating a website or whatever it may be. So that's how I would sort of think about sequencing the unit, so that the three pieces of the IPA are within the unit, not all the way at the end, and it's something I can sort of more reasonably do and have time to give learners feedback. So this would be sort of the structure of how that unit would unfold. I'm not going to open class and be like, okay, guys, read this. I have to establish a meaning. Why are we reading this? What is the point of reading this? Is there some key vocab they need to learn that I need to pre-teach so that they can access the resource and be successful with it? You know, I need to anticipate vocabulary, so some content maybe that they're like, you know, they're probably not familiar with this. I need to build their background knowledge, essentially. So we start with this preparation. How am I getting them ready before we read the resource? And that could take 10 minutes. That could take 30 minutes. It depends on your level and what the resource is. Then now that we've gotten you ready for it, and I've said why we're reading this, etc., we're going to actually read it. But what's important here is we're going to read this twice, and we have a goal for why we're reading it. Is step one in the target language? Everything's in the target language. I would 100% do this in the target language. Yes. Yeah, I would say if you feel you need to do this in English, the resource is too hard for them. You need to pick a different resource. So I would absolutely use the target language throughout this. So I've prepared them with the exception, Erin, sorry, the exception, my learning objective for the lesson, I would feel comfortable putting that in English. So I can, you know, whatever, I can explain different gender pronoun, whatever it is. I could put that in English, but the rest of it, I would say keep it in the target language. So now we're going to interpret and read this resource, or it could be viewing or listening, but I'm just going to say reading for simplicity. So learners should be actively reading this twice, and they need to be doing something. That's what's important. So it's not just, okay, read this and then let's talk about it. I want you to read this, and as you read this, maybe I'm going to have you fill out a graphic organizer, and I want you looking for something as you read. Okay, guys, what did you find? Now we're going to read it again, and I want you to add to your graphic organizer and look for these other things that you might not have noticed the first time. So learners really need 2 passes at whatever, at least 2 passes at it, and you're asking them to do something and go a little bit deeper from the first to the second read. So how are they actively engaged? And this should be connected to why you're having them read this in the first place. Now that and again, that could take, if it's a really short one, maybe that's 10 minutes, or maybe that's a 20-minute activity where they're reading it, you're having a little share out on what they read for the first time. Okay, now read it again and look for this. Now we're shifting into interpretation and discussion. So you've read this, for example, I've had you fill out this graphic organizer where you were looking for specific things. With a partner, now I want you, so now we're from interpretive to interpersonal. Here's some key questions I want you to talk about with your partner connected to we included this graphic or table in our book, but it shows how you might use this for a week long. So it's just an example to give a flow of how that structure could be used. Where we're starting with, let's say Monday, we've got one authentic resource. We're preparing them, we're having them read and interpret, again, active engagement, we're discussing it. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we come in, we're looking at a different authentic resource on the same thing. And that could continue. And Friday, we're like, okay, today we've read all these great things. We're going to work on this small presentational. I'm going to have you write a response. I'm going to have you make a short video, not maybe as elaborate as the larger assessment that would come through the IPA, but still something that would focus on developing their presentational skills. I want to share an example from, again, this one's in our book. This is from a colleague of mine here at BU, and he had a theme. Now, this is a university level course on healthcare, and he had a lot of different objectives. So for each of these objectives here, these are his daily learning objectives. He had learners working with different authentic resources on the same theme. So they were reading different articles on healthcare, so because it's a university course, what he had them do was the reading ahead of class with the active engagement and come in and use the time together more for the interpersonal discussion. So there's ways that you can adapt it depending on what your goals are for the unit. So I've just shared a lot of information on that lesson level way to use the IPA, again, moving from interpretive to interpersonal to presentational. That's connected.